He then asked for his hands to be raised to his face so that he could see them, and he curiously remarked, quote, "Useless, useless." One of the most notorious episodes in American history. And he shoots the president in the back of the head. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Before we start, let me offer a bit of a disclaimer. This episode focuses on John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln and the mastermind of the otherwise doomed plot to kill other prominent figures in the American government and military of the time. We've broken this topic down into two episodes, the first of which will focus almost solely on Booth himself, who will be known to many of you, and the second, which will focus on the conspirators that joined with him in the plot and who are much lesser known, and to varying degrees shrouded in mystery and forgotten by history. We're calling this one Bad Actor, Booth and Lincoln, and the corresponding episode we're calling Bit Parts, Booth and His Conspirators. So we invite you to toggle back and forth to better understand the complicated details of one of the most notorious episodes in American history. First, some brief notes on the genealogy and upbringing of John Wilkes Booth. He was born on the family farm in Bel Air, Maryland in 1838. But this was not a typical farm family. This was actually a sort of hobby farm owned by his father, the most well-known and renowned Shakespearean actor in the young United States, and that would be Junius Brutus Booth. Junius was English-born and had gained accolades in both his native land and his adopted country. The namesake of the younger Booth was John Wilkes, the radical English politician and rabble-rouser, who was a distant family relative. And Wilkes in his own right was a very fascinating and controversial figure in his own lifetime. He was alternately a British MP, the Sheriff of London, and the Lord Mayor of London, as well as wearing many other hats. In addition, he was known to be a libertine, and for this and other reasons, he was imprisoned on at least a few occasions. We're planning to devote an entire episode to him on an upcoming podcast that we're doing called Lost and Unfound, so check for that when it drops. But most relevant to our topic here is that Wilkes was an ardent supporter of the American cause in his lifetime, and this no doubt heavily influenced the Booth family that had immigrated to the United States. So this is no typical family we're talking about, and some pretty radical genes have been raging for generations. Also worth mentioning is John's brother, Edwin, who was also a noted actor of the day, and more importantly to our story, was a noted Union sympathizer, and he'll play a minor role in this story. J.W. receives an early classical education, but was an unremarkable student, and he left school at 14 and became largely self-educated. It's pretty clear that his passion is not for book learning, but rather to continue in his family's tradition of taking to the stage. But he is also very interested in the fractious politics of his time, and at 16 he became an acolyte of sorts to a man named Henry Winter Davis, a radical Republican congressman from Maryland. What's interesting here is that Davis was a fervent opponent of slavery. I think it's fair to say that this early involvement with Davis and his later about-face portends Booth's often contradictory political and philosophical beliefs throughout his short life. So he's alternating now between his political passions and his stage ambitions, and he becomes very quickly successful at the latter. At a ripe age, he became a popular, if gaffe-prone, actor, known for winning over audiences with incredible charisma and enthusiasm for his craft. His performances were said to be, quote, incredibly physical and acrobatic. So he was a showstopper for sure and fabulously charismatic. He was considered very handsome, if not dashing, and his fan base of female theater-going admirers, let's call them groupies, quickly rose. And like his father, he tackled virtually all major Shakespearean leads and was known to have claimed that his favorite was Brutus, the slayer of a tyrant. See where this is going? By 1860, still in his early 20s, he was probably the wealthiest actor in the United States, earning $20,000 a year. That's about $750,000 today. And remember, this is long before Broadway and Hollywood and the like. By the onset of the Civil War, his performances expanded from not only just Richmond, Baltimore, D.C., and the Mid-Atlantic to all the major cities of the country at that time, north and south, and stretching probably as far west as St. Louis and Chicago, etc. He first performed at Ford's Theater in Washington in November of 1863, and this is a harbinger of what was to come 2 years later. Curiously, at this first performance at Ford's Theater, he was actually invited during the intermission by President Lincoln, who had attended this play, to sort of have a meet and greet. But Booth wanted nothing of it, and he declined without any explanation. Now we'll move on to talk about his pro-secession views, his anti-Union fanaticism, and the plot to initially kidnap Lincoln. Let's take a quick minute to back up a few years earlier, and that would be 1859, when Booth was known to have personally attended the hanging of the famous abolitionist John Brown at Harper's Ferry in what was then Virginia, now West Virginia. This should not be surprising, as Booth probably would have been eager to see the famous abolitionist hang. But what seems more interesting is that he expressed at the time a certain reverence in both letters and personal conversations for Brown. And despite being in direct opposition regarding the slavery issue, he was said to have praised the old man's tenacity in his beliefs and his courage at the gallows. Well, as the Civil War kicks off and progresses, Booth continued to perform at a frenetic pace in both North and South, but increasingly made his pro-Confederate views more pronounced and aggressive. He is arrested in St. Louis while on tour for making, quote, treasonous remarks with regards to Lincoln. But despite a brief remand, his acting skills come in handy, and he pays a fine, and he pledges a, quote, oath of allegiance to the United States. It is also during this period he was known to have become a member of the, quote, Knights of the Golden Circle. Now, who and what is this? Well, I'm pretty sure there were no knights and no circle, but it was a semi-secret society committed to the preservation and promotion, really, of slavery as an institution. And there's way too much on this organization to go into here, but he was a known member of that. Very interesting and creepy organization. Yet, despite all these hardcore views, he ironically became secretly engaged to Lucy Lambert Hale, and she was the daughter of New Hampshire Senator John Hale, who just happened to be a staunch abolitionist. So this guy's on a seesaw. Well, this guy's about to jump off the seesaw. And as the South's fortunes waned in the latter stages of the war, Booth became increasingly despondent about having not enlisted in the Confederacy. He wrote a letter to his mother, quote, I have begun to deem myself a coward and to despise my own existence. So it goes without saying that this is a very conflicted man. As the outcome of the war became increasingly obvious in favor of the North, he finally begins to disclose to several associates his dastardly plans to kidnap the president. The idea, if you can call it that, was to take Lincoln hostage, smuggle him across the Potomac to the teetering Confederate capital of Richmond, and exchange him for Confederate POWs. His deranged thinking was that this would somehow convince the populace of the North as to the legitimacy of the Confederacy. It's not just Monday morning quarterbacking to say that this plan is totally nonsensical, and in my thinking borders on total delirium. But he's hell-bent on his ill-conceived scheme, and in between stage performances, he eagerly spills the beans of his intentions to associates at various clandestine meetings and Baltimore, and Washington, and even to other Confederate sympathizers and spies as far away as Boston and Montreal. Among his most enthusiastic adherents were Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, John Surratt, Dr. Samuel Mudd, and many others, all of whom we'll learn more about in the companion episode. By now, he's totally unhinged and increasingly launches into verbal tirades against Lincoln in both private and public. Because of this, he became totally estranged from his pro-Union siblings and was banned from their homes. And now he attends Lincoln's second inauguration with 3 of his fellow eventual conspirators. A few weeks later, Booth learned that Lincoln was due to attend a charity play at a hospital near the Soldiers' Home, which was a few miles outside of D.C., and he decided that this is the place to put the kidnapping scheme into action. So the would-be kidnappers were assembled and they waited in hiding along the roadside, ready to pounce. But guess what? The president opted out at the last minute and therefore never showed, so there was no show. Aww. Ironically, unbeknownst to Booth, Lincoln chose instead to attend a reception at the National Hotel in D.C. That is the exact same hotel in which Booth was staying at the time. So his kidnapping career is off to a pretty bad and, I would say, laughable start. On April 12th of 1865, Booth learns of Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and therefore the Confederate cause is officially now null and void. No reason to kidnap now, as there's nothing to exchange. So there's only one option left, and that's to climb a few notches up on the felony food chain, and that, of course, is murder. Booth very shortly learns that Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, as well as General Grant and his wife, will be attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater just 2 nights later on April 14th. So he hurriedly assembles his team again and makes arrangements with a livery stable owner named James Pumphrey to arrange a getaway horse. Though he would later be jailed after being implicated as an accessory to the plot, Pumphrey was eventually cleared, and it remains unknown if he was aware of Booth's intentions at all. So now it's time to dole out the deadly orders. Booth very hurriedly assigns Lewis Powell to murder Secretary of State William Seward in his home. He assigns the hapless George Atzerodt to murder the Vice President Andrew Johnson at his hotel. And he chooses David Harold to orchestrate the getaway for the gang. And of course, as the leading man that he was, he anoints himself to assassinate the president and the general and deliver the coup de grace. Well, as I think most of us know, this master plan was very seriously botched, but ultimately the prime target was killed. As a sign of divine intervention, I guess, Grant and his wife decided not to attend the play, after all, and instead boarded a train north for a well-earned vacation. After all, the guy did just win the war. So that left the big fish and his wife in the balcony box with a few of their handlers. Let's keep in mind that Booth had unfettered access to Ford's Theater as he was its most famous performer. He also maintained a long-standing friendship with its founder and owner, John Ford. He even received his mail there. The actor arrived at the theater around 9:30 p.m. or so in the evening, and a little after 10, he storms into the presidential box and he shoots the president in the back of the head. He mortally wounds him. Lincoln would die of his wounds at the Peterson House, which was across from the theater, early the next morning. Major Henry Rathbun, who was in the presidential box as protection, lunged at Booth in a brief melee that ensued, almost preventing his escape. But J.W. stabs him and then famously leaps from the box and shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis!" Translation, thus always to tyrants. And these are the classic words, of course, attributed to Brutus upon the assassination of Caesar. Irony, anybody? There remains a debate as to whether he injured his leg while jumping from the box or did so later during his escape, but either way, he did break his fibula. And don't shed a tear for your narrator, But as I record this, I too have a broken fibula, and it ain't fun. He boarded a horse outside the theater, being held for him by prearrangement with an employee of Ford's theater named Edmund Spangler, who was later implicated and imprisoned. Booth rendezvoused with Harold, and the two escaped to the heavily forested hinterlands of southern Maryland on a pre-planned route known to be generally sympathetic to the Confederate cause. At midnight, they arrived at Mary Surratt's Tavern, about 10 miles out of D.C., and this is where they had stored guns and supplies meant for the earlier kidnapping plot. And then by 4 a.m., the two have headed to the rural retreat of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who splinted Booth's injured leg and harbored the duo there for anywhere from several hours to more than a day. They would then proceed to connect with two foster brothers, Samuel Cox and Thomas Jones, both Confederate spies. And at this point, the pitchforks are out, the torches are out, and the War Department issues a $100,000 bounty reward. A really staggering sum at the time, almost $2 million today. While hiding out, Booth was handed newspapers of the assassination and reportedly fell into despair at the near universal outrage that was expressed at the killing of the president. So his dreamed of martyrdom was never going to be fulfilled. Though there were, of course, some hardcore of the Lost Confederacy that would later posthumously celebrate him, the as yet unknown killer was widely loathed by most of the populace on both sides. Even many prominent Confederate generals decried the murder, including Robert E. Lee. An estimated 7 million people lined the rail tracks as Lincoln's corpse was led to his resting place in Springfield, Illinois, and about 1.5 million viewed his coffin. These are astonishing numbers, considering the population at the time and just the ability to move around and transportation, etc. So this was a very dramatic scene. And to that point, one reporter called the reaction, quote, "the mightiest outpouring of grief the world has yet seen." Now, that may be hyperbole. There's a lot of human history before this. But nevertheless, it was an incredible show of love and respect for the recently deceased president. Well, as the president is being committed to the earth, Booth and Harold are still on the lam, and they were provided a small boat by Jones in an attempt to get to Virginia, but it got lost and he ended up back on the Maryland side of the river. A known Confederate named Colonel John Hughes gave them shelter for another crossing the next day. And during this period, Booth writes in his diary, quote, "With every man's hand against me, I am here in despair. And why? For doing what Brutus," here we go again, "for doing what Brutus was honored for, and yet I for striking down a greater tyrant than they ever knew. I am looked upon as a common cutthroat." The two were tracked to a farm near Port Royal, Virginia, owned by Richard Garrett, who was presumably unaware of the killing of Lincoln. Now, news did travel slow in these days, but that's... Booth and Harold used aliases and posed as Confederate soldiers returning home from the Battle of Petersburg. And they hid out in Garrett's tobacco barn until discovered on April 26th. So they were able to hold out for almost 2 weeks. And they were discovered by soldiers under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Everton Conger that had been dispatched to hunt the two down. Upon being found out, Harold surrendered quickly and without incident. But Booth, of course, refused to do the same and proclaimed, quote, "I prefer to come out and fight. And here we go again, one man against the world in a doomed attempt at who knows what." So the soldiers set fire to the barn in an attempt to smoke him out. And then something strange happens. Claiming that Booth aimed a pistol at the soldiers, a Sergeant Boston Corbett shot Booth in the neck, mortally wounding him. And there's a note here, and it's another shameless plug. We will be covering Boston Corbett's incredibly mysterious and bizarre life on one of our other podcasts called Lost and Unfound, and we hope you'll take a listen to that one. And rather than being applauded, Conger was furious at Corbett's unilateral decision to shoot him, and he wrote to his superiors that Corbett took his actions, quote, "without order, pretext, or excuse, and he asked that he be officially disciplined for disobeying orders. Booth died 3 hours later, 2 weeks shy of his 27th birthday, reportedly muttering, "Tell my mother I died for my country." He then asked for his hands to be raised to his face so that he could see them, and he curiously remarked, quote, "Useless, useless." In Booth's pocket was his diary, a compass, and 5 pictures of women, 4 actresses, and his fiancée, Lucy Hale. Though he never officially confessed to Lincoln's murder, the words in his diary confirmed his guilt. Among his confessions were, quote, "Our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment." His corpse was taken to the Washington Navy Yard and was identified by 10 people known to him, and a tattoo, JWB, on his left hand. What a hipster he was. This is 1865. Wow. His body was buried in the Arsenal Penitentiary Yard, and his remains were later transferred to the family burial plot in 1869. If you'd like to lay flowers or spit on his grave, you can find him at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.